People wondered why it's called Sans Souci, which means carefree in French. It's kind of carefree. And a lot of people thought that it was modelled on an Austrian castle that was also called Sans Souci. And they thought, oh, this is because the new king of Haiti was trying to kind of model himself on kind of the kind of genteelness of, you know, sort of Western architecture or something. But there's another history to this, which is even more interesting, right? And this is the hidden history within a hidden history. What I'm trying to get at here is when you look at parts of history, and you know, if you can take the surface, but there's sometimes really interesting stuff underneath which is obscured. What this historian pointed out was that there was this moment just before the success of the Haitian revolutionaries in defeating the French in 1802. There was this moment where the French wanted to do a deal, where the French army said, you know, the French state basically said, under Napoleon, said, we'll do a deal with you. We want to integrate your slave army into the French army, and we'll kind of do a deal, right? And it was partly because they'd lost so many men, and they didn't think they'd be able to defeat this army, so they did a kind of deal. And Henri Christophe was one of the military leaders who agreed to that deal. Now, Henri Christophe was a Creole, which meant that he'd been born in Haiti, right? So I can divide the population of slaves in Haiti into two groups, loosely. Those slaves had been born on the island and were somewhat assimilated into Haitian culture. And then there was another group called the Bossales. And the Bossales had been born in West Africa. They were recent slaves that had been brought over from West Africa. And the Bossales refused to compromise with the French. The Bossales said, no, if we compromise with the French, we will not get rid of slavery. In order to get rid of slavery, we have to defeat all of the European powers regardless, right? So the Bossales refused to compromise, carried on the guerrilla war, right? And one of their leaders was a guy called Sans Souci, right? And he was one of the key people who resisted, was intransigent to this idea of doing a deal with the French. As a result, they actually defeated the French. The French withdrew and left. Christophe became the new king, but as a result, they'd been fighting each other. The Bossales had been intransigent. Henri Christophe had stood with the French and with a lot of other leaders, and you know, had fought them. So you'd think after the French left, that Haiti was independent, that this would be all over now and everything be sorted out. Henri Christophe became the king, and he invited Sans Souci and all of the other intransigent Bossale leaders to this place. It's before the palace was actually built, but they invited them for a parley and to meet and to say, you know, we've got independence for Haiti. And then he murdered a lot. And the story goes in Haiti that he took Sans Souci and buried him in the ground along with his followers. They built this palace on top of them, and that's why it's called the Palais Sans Souci, because certain aspects of West African culture said that you should bury your enemies under your house. That way you control them, their spirits. So this castle actually represents a history of the people who really won freedom and defeated all the European powers, and the people who did not compromise, but it's hidden behind this facade of a king. Next. Right, problematic histories, unpopular histories. So I was mentioning this earlier on, so I think these are people who are in the British Union of Fascists. These are women in the British Union of Fascists. And so I brought this up, it's something we're working on right at the moment. There's a book being written called Lady Blackshirts, Suffragettes Who Joined the British Union of Fascists. This is Mary Richardson. She was a very important suffragette activist and leader in the Women's Political and Social Union. She became, this is Mary Richardson when she was a suffragette, and this is Mary Richardson in about 1934 as the head of the British Union of Fascists Women's section. So this is problematic, because the suffragettes are usually framed in a kind of progressive social democratic narrative fighting for the votes for women. The problem is that a large number of suffragette leaders, particularly those from wealthy and upper class backgrounds, actually joined fascist parties and were very important in organising in them. And also, the first fascist party in Britain, which was called the British Fascisti and was set up in 1923, was set up by a woman who was, I forgot her name now, Rota, she got a funny name, Rota, something like that. Anyway, she was associated with the suffragettes. How can this happen? what's this all about? And why don't I know this? Is my question with things like this. Why don't I know the large numbers of suffragettes who were very important in the organisation prior to the First World War ended up joining Mosley's fascists, and not only that, getting interned during the Second World War. They got interned in the Isle of Man. Now the reason they were interned is because they were intransigent fascists. So how can these women, who, I mean, as far as I'm aware, fascism doesn't promote the idea of feminism, does it? As far as I'm aware. So how the hell could that happen? And so you have to trace a history here of something which is unpopular, and you find if you go backwards, it gets even more. There's more history you don't even know about. So you start here with the British Union of Fascists in 1934 and suffragettes being centrally involved in that. If you trace back in history, you end up with the period of 1914 to 1980, when the suffragette movement split, the leadership of which was so nationalist that the British government banned their newspapers. They were so pro-war, I cannot explain how pro-war they were. If the British government in 1915 was trying to ban your newspaper, Britannica, because you were so pro-war, so too nationalist, how could you be too nationalist during the First World War? Well, what they were saying is that the Britannica, the paper of the suffragettes at the time, was saying that the government was full of pro-German traitors. Right? The Foreign Office and the Home Office was too soft. They weren't prosecuting the war hard enough. Right? And they actually their paper was banned for a while. So how did these suffragettes, how did this organisation that was fighting for the rights of women end up being so reactionary? To the point where a large number of them end up in fascist parties in the 1920s and 30s. So I'm not going to answer that question now, but I'm going to say, did you know about that? Because I didn't know about this till about a month ago. I knew a little bit about the First World War. So we've got a problem here. So it seems to me, when I read a book about Bristol suffragettes, there's a new one came out about a year ago, it doesn't talk about any of this. It doesn't talk about this. So why doesn't it talk about it? Right, I'm going to finish it off now. So I'm going to look at three new, or not new, but new ways that are appearing of doing sort of oral, doing history from below, new ways of research, getting around some of these problems of dealing with informal organisations and events that are clandestine or events that are unpopular or that don't appear in the general sort of historical narratives we have about our great progressive Britain. So this is an example of something which happened. This is a demonstration in 1932 by the National Unemployed Workers Movement in Bristol. And basically it's being broken up by the police violently, which they did a lot. The police injured and lots and lots of people in 1931 and 32 that were marching for jobs and for not having to have their benefits cut. So this example of one of those marches in February the 23rd, 1932. And why I put it up is we wrote a pamphlet on these marches, and then we did some walks around town. And what we found is when we did the walks, which was really interesting, was that people turned up for these walks, Bristolians, and they had stories. So for example, one woman turned up and said, oh yeah, the means test. The means test was terrible. They used to come to your house and they would take away your, if you had anything except the very basic furniture, like a table and two chairs, you had to sell everything. All the toys had to be sold, all the kids' stuff had to be sold before they'd give you benefits. Yeah, we wrote that down. And then another bloke on the walk turned up and said, oh yeah, my granddad was on that. And somebody else said, yeah, that's why I'm here as well, because my granddad was on that. They used to talk about this. And so what we discovered in Bristol was that there was a kind of subterranean history, because this definitely wasn't popularised much, and you could find out about it in academia, and there was, a pamphlet written by us, but it was very hard to find out, even though lots and lots of people seem to know about it. So why did lots and lots of people know about it? It hadn't been written about. So what we discovered was effectively a subterranean history. And sometimes when you do public events with people, and you get involved with people on this kind of level, not in academia, you'll find out all sorts of interesting stuff, or interesting stories and narratives that they hold and have been passed on through the generations. Because obviously none of those people were actually there. I did meet three old blokes who were very old a few years ago who remember this as children. And I met somebody the other day, or I interviewed somebody the other day who was down there when he was 10. So you know, this is a kind of event now which is receding into history that you can't get oral history from easily anymore. But we did find, why we circled this is because when I was writing about it, I was looking for some oral history of this event, and I found this really weird, by chance, thing in the British Library. The British Library running this whole programme for capturing regional accents. So they'd interviewed this geezer because he had a really strong Bristol accent, and what he happened to be talking about was this event. And he said he'd obviously, in this bit of oral history, which we'd only kept because they wanted to get a Bristolian accent, he was talking and he got this picture and he said, oh yeah, that's me there. That's him there. And he said, what happened is, this bloke in front of me, this bloke behind me had a banner, and it was that banner there, he said. And he said, do you know what it said on that banner? And I was like, what does it say? Because it's facing the other way. And he said, it said, we want power, not pancakes. Right? Good communist slogan, right? Because it was Shrove Tuesday. Right? So he said, that's what was on the banner. And he said, I remember it, he said, because that's the banner that hit me in the back of the head. and the interviewer said, well, what happened? He said, well, this copper here, he pointed, he just came in to batter me, right? Smashed my head in. And the bloke behind me with the power up pancakes banner tried to throw it in his face and hit him in the back of the head and knocked me down. So he said he was helping me up, and the copper went on and bashed some other people. But the point about this is that through interacting with the public, you can find stuff that's not in archives, or difficult to find bits of information, difficult bits of oral history. Next. Right, this is another thing. Right? So I was saying earlier on when we were chatting outside that a lot of academics sneer at what's, do you know what I mean? Family history is absolutely massive now, right? I mean, if you go to any archive in the country, they'll tell you that 2/3 at least of the people who are down the archives all the time are doing family history. There's a massive amount of family history, community history being done online, family history. It's a huge business if you go to any of these conventions. And to be honest, I was always a bit like, yeah, whatever. Family history, whatever. What does that tell you about anything? It tells you about, you know, my dad was a miner or something. Doesn't tell you about the miners' strike, does it? So I wasn't really interested. I was a bit of a fool because, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on the point of view, I got involved in this project. So this is Rosemary Green, just around the corner from where I live. And so this little football pitch is next to a big housing estate. And it turned out, as we were getting drunk one night, looking at some old maps, that this is a pauper graveyard. So this piece of land here, it turned out, had 4,084 paupers buried in it in unmarked graves. Just here. So and on the top of the hill was a workhouse called Eastfield Workhouse, a massive complex of buildings. And so what the workhouse were doing was that they were basically dumping their dead paupers into this ground. It was cheap and cheerful, saved them a lot of money, and they buried them and nobody ever knew about them. So we found the records. There was a record, and they keep bureaucratic records, these workhouses. So-and-so died on this day, that's it. So you can find out their age and their name and stuff like that. So we painfully, over about 2 years, collected every single name of the person buried here. And got involved in a community history project. So what we did was we met in the estate, did a public meeting, 40 people turned up to the public meeting and said they were interested, and they got that formed the community history group. And from that we ended up putting a memorial in, which is there, that standing stone, and there you can see all the kids in the local school out and playing to other people. But what happened with this project was, to be honest, I wasn't interested in workhouses at all. They were like, you know, I just wasn't interested. To me, it's just misery. I wasn't, you know, whatever. What I didn't realise is how massively important they are to people in Bristol. Well, certainly, people are very interested in workhouses and pauperism. And I didn't quite grasp it to begin with, but we did a short BBC documentary about this burial ground and the workhouse. And the next day, 3,000 people downloaded the data of the dead people that were buried there. 3,000 people came the next day did that. And I suddenly realised, blimey, everybody's interested in this. Now, it was partly because family historians had been searching for their relatives that they could never find, because they were buried in here without gravestones. But it was also because people reacted to this whole story about people being forgotten, about people being ignored, about people being treated like trash, and they wanted to correct it, and that's what this memorial was doing, saying, no, we're going to mark this place. So it had a kind of resonance, and it certainly had a resonance around what had been happening around austerity. For example, I don't really know, but pauper burials have been increasing rapidly since 2010. Lots of people get buried without, basically the council has to pay for it and do it because they can't afford it. So a lot of people had there was a connection between these kind of ideas of the deserving and undeserving, who gets remembered, who doesn't get remembered, were very prevalent amongst lots of people in Bristol, certainly because of in these times of austerity. But the point about it is that through the family historians, what we uncovered was a whole, not only a subterranean knowledge or memory of the workhouse, but also masses of kind of oral histories of people saying, because this place got turned into an old people's home in the 1930s. So people had a kind of folk memory. They had memories of their own parents talking about it, and it was masses of information that came out talking to family historians about this place. Stuff that was never in the archives and we never would have found. Last one. Right, this is another example of ways of doing research which are quite new. So this picture here represents the Captain Swing riots of 1830 to 31, again written out by the Social Democratic and classical Marxist history to a certain degree. And why the Captain Swing riots are important is that they were, I'll just give you a few figures, they were probably the biggest rural uprising by rural workers in a couple of 100 years. There were over 3,500 incidents over 6 to 8 months of riot, incendiarism, burning things, machine breaking. Because what was happening was rural labourers were, by the 1830s, mechanisation was driving rural, massive underemployment and unemployment amongst rural labourers. It meant that people literally were starving because these groups of workers were already on the lowest wages anyway. And also been 2 really bad harvests, and it all cracked in 1830, in a particular period of unstable political period in British history. It's not a surprise that these events had a part to play in getting us democracy in 1832. 1831. They actually partly the reason that the anti-democratic Tory government was brought down. Anyway, why they're important is because they're not only they're massive events, they were spread over 28 counties of Britain. So they were all over the country, particularly southern England. They spread like wildfire over a few months across the whole country. They were in broad daylight. People would come out in massive demonstrations of rural workers. They would go out and smash the machines up. They were taking their employment away from you. They would extort the wealthy. They didn't kill wealthy people. They didn't kill landowners. They just exerted their power. And why it's called Captain Swing is before these mobs came to the surface, letters would be sent to the landowners and to the gentry, and they would be signed Captain Swing, and they would basically say, if you don't put the wages up or give us work or increase whatever all the demands were, then you're going to burn. Right? We'll start by burning your property, and then we're going to start burning your houses, right? And they would be signed Captain Swing. And Captain Swing seemed to become this viral thing of fear amongst the ruling class. It was like it was viral. That's how we might understand it today. And Captain Swing was a mythical figure. There was no Captain Swing, just as there was no Ned Ludd. These are just tricks that movements played in that period to make the authorities hunt people who didn't exist. But anyway, why it's important is that at the end of the Swing riots, when they were finally put down or stopped, 292 people were sentenced to death, of which 19 were executed. 600 people were transported to Tasmania. Now that's the biggest number of people transported for a common crime in British history. Right? So this is an incredibly important event, right? That again doesn't get much some historical interest, but outside of academia, not that much. There's been some changes in the last few years. Why I brought it up though is because it's a very difficult thing to research. Because if you've got a mass movement which has no formal organisation associated with it, which is spread over 28 counties and over 8 months of stuff happening, is mostly amongst people who are probably can't read and write, right? Never had any kind of famous political leadership or anything at all. Was using various threatening tactics from fires to riot to achieve its aims. How do you research that? How do you find out what these people thought? They didn't write it down. There's no organisation records. There's no meetings where they went, tonight we burn Tonight we decided to burn the manor house. You know. So what we've got is fragments of information. We've got newspaper reports. We might, obviously not the people speaking. We've got like a few swing letters left behind, and we've got bits and pieces. How do you research something that's so widespread and spread over time and space? How do you do it? I mean, Hobsbawm and Ruday, two famous historians, were again connected to this college. They did a great book actually in 1967 about Captain Swinghouse in 1970, and they couldn't research the whole country. So in 2004, and this goes for all kinds of social research, particularly if it's historical. This group, called the bloody family historians again, isn't it? Family and Community Historical Research Society, they actually came out of the Open University. And what they did was they had to think about this, and they were a group of students that were spread over the country because they were Open University students, so they were dispersed, lived in different places. And they'd done a degree in family and community history, right? So they set this organisation up, and one of the people in the organisation said, you know what, we've got dispersed researchers all over the country, right? Why don't we have a take a look at Captain Swing? Because in order to research a dispersed movement, a social movement in the country, you need dispersed researchers. It was a brilliant idea, and they produced this book. Right? And what this book did is it first of all doubled the number of incidents that were involved in the Captain Swing riots up until that point. So the research massively expanded as a result of this thinking. So the kind of way they did it was, if you were the person who lived in, I don't know, Abingdon, it's near here, isn't it? Right? So you've got an Open University student in Abingdon. He'd go down to the local history group, family historians, and he'd say, right, I've got this pro forma, right, which we've written, and what you do is we need people to go and investigate Captain Swing. So can you go out to the parish of Otmore, right, and go and look at their records and see if you can investigate the Swing riot. So then write all the information down or type it into our online form and send it in. It all went centrally, and through doing that all over the country, using hundreds of researchers, they came up with this brilliant bit of research, which massively expanded the knowledge up until that point, made these events even more important than they were before. So it's a kind of way of thinking about doing research now, especially, again, this is history from below. How do you research the swing riots? There's no central record you can go to. You can read what the government thought about it. You can't read what these people were thinking or how they were organising or any of that. That's just not there. It's just not there. So you have to be thinking around it, and let's pick the last one. So these are the two groups that, this is our group, Bristol Road History, if you're interested in finding out more about this stuff. And this network here is an international network called the History from Below Network, which we're part of. So it's across 5 continents now. People doing all sorts of different kinds of historical research and promoting or putting out the history in all sorts of different ways, from historical recreations to art to film or whatever, or boring talks like this. So, so I definitely go and have a look at their website. This is a really trendy website.
It's very cool and sexy.
Yeah. And this one's not so cool.
Functional.
less cool and sexy, but actually more content.
Yeah.
But that's good. It's definitely worth having a look just to see what people are up to. And that's the reason this talk was originally called History's the New Punk, because that's their slogan. It is.
Our slogan.
Sorry, our slogan. That's okay, our slogan, but in their organisation. So you'll see there's an article which kind of is part of this talk on that website called History's the New Punk, and that's it.
Do I want to buy a camera? Have we got any questions for Dr. Ball?
I'll be checking the notes later. What's that? Oh yeah, have a look. It's Trio is name, but it's definitely it's good history because it's not just talking about Haiti. It's talking about how history is remembered and how it's obscured as well. So yeah, that's all right. You don't have to ask any questions.
Would you say it's true that in the current context, quite a lot of informal activism gets hijacked by formal organisations, or appear to.
Exactly, yeah, and that is a really good point. I mean, in fact, one example was brought up earlier on, which is Rock Against Racism, for example. So I would say that although Rock Against Racism had a formal organisational part, which was definitely dominated by the Socialist Workers' Party at the time, as it actually, as a thing in itself, it was more of a social movement. So we have this issue about how social movements express themselves. So social movements can have different organisational forms, but they don't actually necessarily have to have a kind of formal political party or anything that controls them. And I think that was the issue around RAR, for example, was that there was a kind of on the ground thing going on with RAR. It had a big cultural influence, and then there was the organisational group, which didn't really have control over it as a totality. So there were two things going on there. I think you're quite right. You'll find, well, we're only talking about today actually about how a particular formal organisation, a housing organisation, kind of took credit for a lot of work that was done by people who are not in a formal organisation.
Yeah.
So you'll see it all the time. And, I mean, my interest really is to say, well, I'm actually interested in what people thought and what their motivations were. You know, why is it people join up together and do something? What were those swing writers thinking? What were those, what was motivating them to do it? And you can say, oh, they were just starving people, but people have desires, they also have dreams, they also have kind of anger, all sorts of things that go on that motivate them to do stuff. And I think trying to get to grips with that is very difficult. I mean, you get to grips with, say, what Arthur Scargill said, perhaps in the future, with the miners' strike, but do you get to grips with what ordinary miners were thinking at the time? And that's always a problem. It's become a bit trendy. I'm not an expert on this, but there's this French historian called or philosopher and historian called Rancière, who I forgot his first name. That's a bit rubbish. But anyway, he's got very popular because he's been looking at all this sort of looking into So when he's looking at 19th century working class history, around the labour movement in France, and what he was sort of doing is he's sort of having a look at it. And most of the time when you talk about things like strikes and what happened historically, you write a sort of narrative about, let's say, silk workers in Lyon or something, and all the struggles that they were involved in to improve their conditions, and how they got involved in revolutions in 1830 or whatever. Blah, blah, blah. And you write a straightforward history. But what Rancière's been doing is trying to find out what they actually felt and believed, what he calls their mentality. What was driving them? Was it just they were reacting? Because often the way that often struggles are written off. For example, those mutinies are a really good example of how things are written off. I mean, you'll find that mutinies, for example, are generally put down to things like food. The food was bad, right? Or a sailor was treated badly, and so in a way you can sort of write off that piece of history by saying, well, they were just angry about the food. Well, funnily enough, there was this thing called the Russian Revolution. There was this thing called the German Revolution. Are we saying that those people did those revolutions because they didn't like the biscuits? Do you see what I mean? It's like, so what you've got to do is try and get into their heads, haven't you? It's not good enough to say, well, they made a demand around biscuits and then there was the Russian Revolution, right? Which actually happened, I think, in 1905. So what does that mean? So that means, what Rancière was saying was, we've got to go and actually find out what they thought. So how do you find out what those sailors thought, or what Rancière did was he managed to find little stores of letters, the private letters written by silk workers who could read and write. And he looked at them and found, of course, there were these desires for a new society. And, so suddenly it was like this, great flowering of these people involved in these struggles weren't just reacting to their conditions, I'm really hungry, or the biscuits are bad, which is often how things are mechanically understood. But actually suddenly these silk workers had consciousness and wanted a future, and just like we do, and so I was saying somebody came up to the bookstore I was running a few weeks ago and said, well, what's this Rancière bloke? What's this book, Proletarian Nights? What's it all about? And I said, he made a stunning revelation, Rancière, that working class people have dreams and desires. So, in a way, that's part of what this is about, History from Below. It's not just going, well, okay, how did these sailors organise this? What did these sailors want? And what did they desire? Even if it was unachievable, because then you start to understand the more subjective elements of why people get involved in political struggles and all sorts of struggles, which are really important. You know, I mean, I think they're massively underrated actually. People do have dreams, desires, and they will put their lives on the line for them as well, which is even more interesting. Is that right?
Any more questions?
Quality
Well,
audience.
Thank you very much for coming, Dr. Ball. Thank you.
Can I have a drink?
Yes, let's give some pub. Does anyone want to buy a camera?
Is he going to put that on Facebook for us?
He's going to email it to me, and they're going to put it on the. So Ruskin's got a YouTube channel. It was like 3 years, and literally found out. Because I was wondering what they did with the talks they filmed. They put them on YouTube. So
Yeah, I mean, it's basically that way, but the issue I've always had is the choosing method.
yes, yeah, there is a
I
choice.
mean, every time I've attended, just as an observation, the
Yeah.
camera points at people. Someone from Warren Mont, she was speaking their own opinion, and all of a sudden she hear, I'm speaking as an individual.
Sorry, yeah.
I see what you mean.
I completely with
Yeah, it has an
So when
influence.
people, yeah, when people
I
ask
think when
questions,
you're giving oral history, you might give your true opinion, but once that thing is put in your face,
Yeah.
it does, I mean, unconsciously or deliberately as a...
But I
definitely-
tone things down a bit.
I'm definitely, yeah, so I'm
So I think
definitely
it's
conscious of that.
unconscious most of the time. If people become aware that it's there and they wonder what's its purpose, where does it go?
I'm
It's
definitely
never
conscious
explained.
of it. I think I go to, I've been to talks here and everything, and I would definitely tone down my, not well, language, yeah, but my revolutionary talk, shall we say.
Well, what you could say, what you could
the talk of how we might achieve things. I wouldn't.
What you could say is new media is suppressing your thoughts and feelings.
Well, the worst thing about it is if it's on there, what happens is you get somebody watches it and then they go, it was actually 46,000 British songs.
Yeah. That's the other thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's better than more. I just know that I think that's an influence that's usually silent.
Yeah, I see. I had it a meeting a while back, and I'm the same. I kind of feel.
Particularly if you identify yourself as well, because there's a lot of people saying, who are you, what's your background, that's irrelevant, just a lot of people got to say.
Yeah, I wouldn't
And
say
then it takes,
there was a trade union talk here a while back where people were talking about bosses and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the cameras goes back to you're not going to say the boss is a scumbag. It's going to be on YouTube.
it's just the frustration because it's
How are you?
No, I didn't know
Thanks for coming.
this issue of like self-organised groups to do things, but 7%. And then the outset said, is anything that you do not want to do?
Yeah,
Which is disability activists who can affect the benefits. And quite a few people. And it frustrates the donors because they're thinking it's an open, it should just be completely open, but it's just the kind of, whatever else was there.
And I think, I remember being at some before, and saying, if you don't want to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a courtesy,
Come
something.
and see me afterwards, and I'll make sure you're not.
It's the audience, the audience.
Yeah.
definitely. And we've said like, sometimes we don't pan camera.
Yeah,
So we say, well, this camera, there's something contentious, it's like, you just keep the camera on the speaker and you can hear voices, but...
no, went to the LSE ones, and it's only that's the first time I noticed it. Wasn't it there? I was in a long, very good work. And the camera
Got
was
£4 per sit.
That's just
He was
fine, yeah.
Yeah.
He was a break. He was a break in the 7-8 discussion, and he was processed in the actual thing, in the sort of back.
What you said at the end.
The videos we play itself in fast speed, high speed, someone was actually going
I
through.
did it.
And you don't get, there's just zero explanation of what the purpose is.
I know what you're going.
I'm sure he got pulled away. That was very
That's
much
right.
you. Let me just stop the camera.
Yeah, you better check the end of it because Sam was dancing naked in front of us.
Oh, I don't know if I want to see that.
I didn't